What does it take to build the largest contiguous land empire in the history of the world, starting from nothing? Not from a throne, not from inherited wealth, not from a city or a standing army, but from a fragmented and violent steppe, where a boy without a father had almost no claim to anything at all. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hotsteel.
Good evening, Clara.
There is a man whose name has carried the weight of terror and transformation in equal measure for 8 centuries. A man who rose from abandonment and near starvation to reshape the political map of an entire continent. Tonight, we turn to a leader who did not inherit power, but constructed it from the ground up, forging a new kind of state out of the most unlikely materials imaginable. The question before us is how a boy named Temujin, born into a minor clan on the Central Asian steppe, became the man who united the Mongol tribes and set in motion the most rapid territorial expansion in recorded history.
The answer requires us to first understand the world he was born into, because the steppe of the 12th century was not simply a backdrop, it was the problem he spent his entire life solving.
We are speaking about Genghis Khan.
Genghis Khan was the founder of the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in history, and the man who transformed a fragmented collection of nomadic tribes into a unified and devastatingly effective military and political force.
Then let us begin with the steppe itself, and with the childhood that made Temujin the man he became.
Temujin was born around 1162, near the Onon River. His father was Yasuge, a minor chieftain who had acquired a bride for his son through an arrangement with a neighboring tribe, and who had ambitions for his family's standing on the steppe. But Yasuge was poisoned by enemies while Temujin was still a child, and his passing transformed the family's situation entirely. The followers who had attached themselves to his leadership dispersed, leaving his widow and children without allies, livestock, or protection.
So the death of his father did not just remove a parent, it removed the entire social structure that made survival possible.
Exactly. On the steppe, power was relational. A chief was only as strong as the network of obligations, alliances, and loyalties around him. Without followers, the family was left to survive on roots, berries, and whatever small game they could catch. Temujin was captured and enslaved by a rival clan at some point during his early adolescence, a humiliation that he eventually escaped through a combination of cunning and assistance from a sympathetic guard. The steppe world he inhabited was one of perpetual riding, blood feuds, shifting alliances, and the constant threat of violence from competing clans. Survival required ruthlessness and political intelligence in equal measure.
So the environment itself was the training ground. He did not learn statecraft in a court. He learned it in conditions that would have destroyed most people.
Yes, and this is precisely where the popular myth must be challenged. The common image of Genghis Khan is one of pure violence, a conqueror driven by appetite for destruction. The historical record shows something far more calculated. From his earliest political moves, Temujin displayed an unusual and consistent talent for building durable coalitions rather than simply winning individual confrontations. He sought out alliances with powerful figures, most notably with Togrul, the Khan of the Karaite tribe, who became a patron and adopted father figure. He used these relationships to accumulate followers and resources over years of careful positioning.
So the foundation of the empire was not conquest. It was a long and deliberate accumulation of relationships.
Exactly, and one of the most consequential early decisions he made was about how to treat followers who came over from defeated enemies. The traditional steppe practice was to absorb the common people of a defeated group into the victorious tribe and to execute or enslave their leaders. Temujin reversed the second part of this logic selectively. Warriors who had shown loyalty to their former leaders, even in battle against him, were often welcomed into his force rather than punished. He understood that a man who had been loyal once could be loyal again, and that killing capable fighters was a waste he could not afford.
So loyalty itself became the currency, not blood, not clan, not birth.
Yes, and that shift was radical in the context of the steppe. Tribal society organized everything by kinship. Temujin was proposing a different principle entirely, one based on merit and demonstrated commitment rather than ancestry. He reorganized his growing force using a decimal system borrowed and extended from earlier steppe military traditions. Units of 10, 100, 1000 were commanded by officers chosen for their ability, not their birth. The unit of 10 was not simply a tactical formation, it was a unit of mutual accountability. Every man in a group of 10 was responsible for the others. If one man fled the field, the rest were punished. If all 10 fled, the commander of 100 was held to account.
So, the structure built collective discipline into the smallest unit of the army.
Exactly, and this discipline was combined with a tactical flexibility that set the Mongol army apart from every military force it would encounter. The Mongol warrior was above all a mounted archer, trained from childhood in horsemanship and the composite bow. He could shoot accurately while riding at full speed, engage an enemy at range, and disengage before contact if the tactical situation required it. The feigned retreat was among the most effective and most documented tactics in Mongol warfare. A force would appear to flee the field, drawing the enemy into pursuit, and then turn and envelop them when they had broken formation in the chase.
So defeat could itself be a trap.
Yes, and the armies that pursued them, accustomed to the logic of conventional engagement, repeatedly fell into it. But the military dimension, while striking, was only one part of what Temujin built. As his power grew through the late 12th century, he began to address the political structure of the steppe more systematically. In 1206, at a great assembly called the Kurultai, the Mongol tribes formally recognized Temujin as their supreme ruler, and granted him the title Genghis Khan, a name whose precise meaning is debated, but which carries the sense of universal or oceanic ruler.
So 1206 was not the beginning of his rise. It was the formal recognition of something that had already been built.
Exactly. At the same assembly, he promulgated the Yasa, a code of laws that governed the behavior of his subjects and the structure of the empire. The Yasa has not survived in complete form, but its contents are partially known through later sources. It prohibited theft, required the protection of diplomatic envoys, established rules for the division of spoils, and encoded the principle of religious tolerance, meaning that the faiths of conquered peoples were to be respected rather than suppressed.
So the man associated with devastation also codified religious tolerance as law.
Yes, and that tension runs through his entire legacy. The Yasa also required that ambassadors and envoys be given safe passage under all circumstances, which had profound implications for trade and diplomacy across Eurasia. After 1206, the campaigns began in earnest. The Zcca kingdom in northwestern China was subdued by 1210. The Jurchen Jin dynasty, which controlled northern China, was attacked beginning in 1211. The Mongol assault on the Jin involved siege warfare, which required a different approach entirely from steppe combat. Genghis Khan adapted by incorporating Chinese engineers and their siege technology into his force, allowing him to take fortified cities that would otherwise have been impregnable to nomadic cavalry.
So he did not simply impose his existing methods. He absorbed the capabilities of those he encountered.
Yes, and this is one of the defining characteristics of Mongol expansion that is frequently underestimated. The empire was not only a military machine, it was a learning organization that continuously incorporated the skills, technologies, and expertise of conquered peoples. Administrators, engineers, physicians, astronomers, and scribes from across the conquered world were absorbed into Mongol service. Literacy was rare among the Mongols themselves, so they recruited literate administrators from every culture they encountered. Genghis Khan himself commissioned the creation of a Mongol script, adopting a modified version of the Uyghur alphabet for administrative purposes, recognizing that an empire required written records.
So the empire created the conditions for its own administration as it expanded.
Yes, the turn westward came after the opening of the campaign against the Khwarezmian Empire, a powerful Islamic state controlling much of Central Asia and Persia. The trigger for this campaign is well documented. Genghis Khan had sent a large trade caravan to the Khwarezmian governor of Otrar, who had the merchants executed and their goods confiscated. A subsequent diplomatic mission was also treated with contempt. Genghis Khan responded with a campaign that reduced some of the most prosperous cities in the Islamic world to ruins. Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, and others were taken and heavily damaged, and populations that resisted faced enormous consequences.
So the destruction was not random. It was calibrated. Cities that surrendered were treated differently from those that resisted.
Exactly, and this is a crucial distinction that is often lost in the broad strokes of his reputation. Those that opened their gates and offered submission could expect to be incorporated rather than erased. This was not mercy in a sentimental sense, it was strategy. Intact cities with functioning economies paid tribute and provided resources. Destroyed cities produced nothing. The intelligence system that preceded Mongol campaigns was another element that consistently surprised their opponents. Spies, merchants, and traveling envoys gathered information about terrain, fortifications, internal politics, and the morale of enemy forces before armies even moved.
So the campaign was already half won before the first riders crossed the border.
Yes, and the speed with which Mongol forces could move remained one of their most disorienting advantages. Their armies traveled with multiple horses per rider, rotating mounts to sustain a pace that their opponents consistently failed to anticipate. Coordinated campaigns operating across hundreds of miles of terrain required a communication system that could keep multiple columns synchronized. The Mongols maintained relay stations across their territory, the Yam system, where fresh horses were kept so that messages could travel at extraordinary speed. A message could travel from one end of the empire to the other in days rather than weeks, which gave Genghis Khan a command and control capability that was without parallel in his era.
So the empire was held together, not just by force, but by information moving faster than the enemy could respond to it.
Exactly. And the Yam network, once it stretched from China to Eastern Europe under his successors, became the backbone of the Pax Mongolica, the period of relative stability and open trade across Eurasia that followed the initial phase of conquest. Genghis Khan passed away in 1227 during a campaign against the Jisiad, whose defeat he had pursued until nearly the end of his life. The exact circumstances of his passing remain unclear, and his burial place was deliberately kept secret. Before his death he had designated his son Ogdai as successor, and established principles for the continuation of the empire. The conquests extended under his sons and grandsons to include Persia, Russia, Korea, and would reach as far west as Poland and Hungary.
So the structure he created was robust enough to continue expanding after him.
Yes, the empire at its greatest extent, under his grandson Kublai Khan, stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Central Europe, encompassing more territory than any empire before or since.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret.
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford.
So this is a work that places the Mongol Empire not only within its own time, but within the longer arc of world history.
Precisely. Weatherford examines how Genghis Khan reorganized Mongol society, developed highly mobile military strategy, and built systems of communication and trade that connected large parts of Eurasia. The book shows how the Mongol networks of exchange influenced commerce, technology, and cultural interaction across continent, making the argument that the Mongol Empire played a foundational role in the emergence of the early modern world.
Is it accessible to someone who has not studied this period before?
It is written with a broad audience in mind. Weatherford brings genuine enthusiasm to the material and presents the evidence clearly, making the scale of what the Mongols achieved legible without requiring specialist knowledge. It is also a work that challenges the reader's assumptions. By the final chapters, the familiar image of Genghis Khan has been substantially complicated by the evidence the book presents.
So reading it gives a reader a more complete picture than the popular image allows.
Yes, and that complexity is precisely what makes it worth reading.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The legacy of Genghis Khan operates on at least two levels that sit in permanent tension with one another. The first is the level of destruction. The campaigns against the Khwarezmian Empire, northern China, and later Persia, and the Abbasid Caliphate under his grandson, Hulagu, produced human suffering and physical devastation on a scale that is difficult to fully comprehend. Some historians have estimated that the Mongol conquests reduced the population of certain regions by substantial fractions. Agricultural systems, irrigation networks, and urban centers built over centuries were disrupted or destroyed in campaigns that lasted only months.
So the speed of Mongol campaigns meant that their consequences in some regions outlasted the empire itself.
Yes, the destruction of the irrigation systems of Mesopotamia, for instance, had effects on agricultural productivity in that region that persisted for generations after the Mongol presence had ended. But the second level of the legacy is equally well documented. Once conquest was complete, the Mongol Empire created conditions for trade and movement across Eurasia that had not existed before, and would not fully exist again until the modern era. The Silk Road, which had functioned as a set of fragmented and insecure routes through many competing polities, became under Mongol rule a network protected by a single authority. Merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and scholars could travel from China to Eastern Europe under the protection of Mongol law.
So the same force that destroyed cities also made it safe to travel between them.
Exactly, and the consequences of that connectivity were far-reaching. Technologies, crops, artistic traditions, and medical knowledge moved between cultures at a pace and scale that would have been impossible without the network the Mongols had created. Marco Polo's journey from Venice to China in the late 13th century was only possible because the Mongol peace made such travel survivable. His accounts of what he witnessed transformed European understanding of Asia. the transmission of printing technology, paper money, and various forms of agricultural knowledge from China to the Islamic world, and eventually to Europe, has been traced in part through the channels the Mongol network opened.
So the empire was also a transmission mechanism for ideas and technologies across the largest landmass on Earth.
Yes, and this is what makes the Mongol Empire so difficult to place within simple moral categories. Its creation involved extraordinary violence, its operation enabled extraordinary exchange. The adoption of the merits-based organizational model that Genghis Khan had developed also had lasting influence on the successor states that emerged after the empire fragmented. The Ilkhanate in Persia, the Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde in Russia, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, each developed administrative systems that blended Mongol organizational principles with local traditions.
So, the political forms he created became a template for successor states across a quarter of the world's land surface.
Yes, and there are further complications in the legacy worth examining. The plague pandemic of the 14th century, which reached Europe with devastating effect in the 1340s, almost certainly traveled along the trade routes the Mongol network had opened. The same connectivity that carried silk, spices, paper, and philosophical ideas between cultures also carried pathogens at a speed and across distances that would not have been possible in the more fragmented world that preceded Mongol unification.
So it did the spread.
Yes, connectivity carries everything, not only the things we choose to send. That is a principle that every era of globalization has had to rediscover. In terms of his enduring presence in historical memory, Genghis Khan occupies very different positions in different parts of the world. In Mongolia, he is the founding figure of the nation, a symbol of unity, strength, and cultural identity. His image appears on currency, on public buildings, and in the national consciousness as the greatest Mongol who ever lived. In Iran and Iraq, his name is associated with the destruction of some of the most sophisticated urban cultures of the medieval Islamic world. In Russia, the Mongol period of domination, which lasted roughly 2.5 centuries, remains a charged and contested part of national historical identity.
So his legacy is genuinely different depending on which side of the empire's path you stand on.
Yes, and that is precisely what makes him one of the most historically significant and historically contested figures in world history. Today, the organizational principles he developed, the elevation of merit over birth, the use of layered command structures with delegated authority, the integration of intelligence gathering into strategic planning, of these appear in modern military and organizational theory, usually without acknowledgement of their steppe origins.
So the structures he built are still operating, even when the name behind them has been forgotten.
Yes, and perhaps that is the deepest measure of a historical figure's reach, not that their name is remembered, but that the structures they created became so embedded in how the world works, that they no longer need to be attributed to anyone.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the origins, the methods, and the lasting contradictions of Genghis Khan and the empire he built.
A boy who had nothing built a structure that held more of the world than any ruler before or after him.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here, where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.